He does not say he loves you. He shows up instead. He fixes the thing that was broken for 3 weeks before anyone else noticed it needed fixing. He checks the tire pressure before a long drive without being asked. He transfers money into the account before the bill arrives, quietly, without comment. You notice these things, or you don't. It seems to make no difference to him either way. This is the first thing visible from the outside. A man who expresses care through function rather than declaration. A man whose emotional vocabulary is almost entirely behavioral. Watch him long enough and a pattern forms, not one isolated incident, but a consistent structural preference for doing over saying, for delivering over discussing, for presence expressed through task completion rather than through words. The pattern is not accidental. It is not personality. It is a translation system built over decades, and it is worth understanding precisely how it was built. The question is not whether this pattern exists. The question is what it is protecting and what it costs to construct, and whether the man inside it has any clear view of the walls. Because something is always being protected. He learned early that love was not a feeling you declared. Love was something you proved. In the households that shaped men now in their 50s, emotional expression was either absent or unpredictable. Fathers who worked without complaint, mothers who managed without asking for help. The ambient message was consistent across variations. Feelings are not the point. What you do is the point. What you provide is the point. A child watching that environment does not develop a theory about love. He develops a practice. He develops a reflex. He develops a way of moving through the world that keeps the feeling protected by enclosing it inside action, where it becomes indistinguishable from duty. He learns that his value is conditional on his usefulness, not because anyone said so directly, because the architecture of the household communicated it without words, the way rooms communicate what they are for before anyone speaks. Praise arrived for achievement. Disapproval arrived for failure. The emotional middle ground, the simple acknowledgement of existing, of mattering independent of function, was either absent or expressed so minimally it barely registered. So he calibrated accordingly. He understood at a level beneath language that his presence was justified by what he contributed. The lesson took. It has not left. That understanding never fully left him, even when everything else changed. What it produced over the following decades was not bitterness, it was something more precise, a structural equation in which love and obligation became functionally identical. Not because he chose that equation consciously, because it was the only one consistently reinforced. Love was what someone did for you when they showed up. Love was what you did for someone else when you carried the weight without being asked. The feeling underneath, the desire, the tenderness, the vulnerability, was not denied. It was simply never given a form that could survive contact with the external world without being misread, dismissed, or used against him. So it found another form. He channeled it into obligation, and obligation became the only reliable container he had. This is not pathology. This is a learned adaptive system, and it is important to understand it as such before going any further. The man who brings obligation to love is not cold. He is not incapable of feeling. He has developed a highly specific mechanism for expressing feeling, one that both protects it from scrutiny and makes it legible to a world that rewards function over disclosure. The feeling is present. The translation is what changed. And the translation, once established, proved extraordinarily durable. The translation became permanent somewhere in the years between 20 and 35. Watch the habit across time and you begin to see how it sustains itself through reinforcement. In his 20s, the behavior reads as dependability.
He is the one who follows through. He is the one who does not cancel. He is the one who quietly handles things before they become problems. Partners notice this and often describe it as strength. Employers notice it and describe it as reliability. He receives consistent reinforcement that this mode of operating is not only effective but valued, that this version of himself is the version others want present. The feedback loop closes tightly. The behavior deepens accordingly. In his 30s, the habit begins to calcify into role, and role begins to calcify into self. He is the provider. He is the fixer. He is the one who does not fall apart. The emotional labor of maintaining that position is real and constant, but it remains invisible, even to him. He does not experience himself as suppressing anything in particular. He experiences himself as simply being the kind of man he is. This is the threshold moment, the point where behavior transitions into identity, where the costume becomes the skin. He is no longer someone who chooses to express care through obligation as a strategy. He is someone for whom obligation is care, not metaphorically, but structurally, not as an approximation, but as the actual thing. The distinction between the two has collapsed, and he has no felt sense that anything has been lost. By the time he reaches 50, the equation is no longer visible to him as an equation at all. It is simply the structure of reality. Of course love looks like this. Of course presence means showing up and handling things. Of course, the way to matter to someone is to make yourself indispensable to their continued functioning. These are not beliefs he examines or defends. They are the water he moves through without registering its weight, the grammar of a language he no longer remembers learning. And this is precisely where the investigation needs to deepen. Because when obligation becomes identity, something happens to responsibility that is worth tracking carefully. Responsibility is no longer something he takes on when circumstances require it. It is something he is. He does not feel responsible for the people in his life the way someone feels responsible for a task they agreed to complete and can, in principle, hand off. He feels responsible the way someone feels responsible for being themselves, a tautology, not a task. It is constitutive of him now, woven into the architecture of the self. Remove the responsibility and a structural question appears, one he cannot answer. What is left when the obligation goes? That question does not surface consciously very often, and when it does, it is usually quickly covered by the production of more obligation. But the behavior it produces underneath the covering is remarkably consistent across men who have followed this developmental path. He does not delegate well, not because he is controlling, though it can appear that way from the outside, but because delegation requires a belief that someone else can carry what he carries with the same fidelity. That belief is structurally incompatible with an identity built around being the one who carries things correctly. Delegation is not a management choice for him. It is a small act of self-dissolution, and he experiences it as such, without having the language to say so. He does not ask for help easily, not because he is proud, though pride is present and real, but because asking for help requires a momentary recognition that he cannot handle this particular thing alone, and that recognition destabilizes something deeper than ego. It destabilizes the self-concept that kept him functional for 30 decades. The internal structure that allowed him to remain reliable and present and valued when everything else was uncertain. He knows at some level that he is not supposed to need the help, not because someone told him, because every reinforcement he received over 40 years of adult life confirmed that the men who are needed are the men who do not themselves need. He does not stop, even when stopping would be rational, even when the cost of continuing is visibly higher than the cost of rest, even when his body is registering the accumulation of years of sustained output, he does not stop in any complete sense. Because stopping is not a behavioral choice he can make the way he can choose to take a different route home.
Stopping is a structural threat. Stopping means the question surfaces. He keeps moving to keep the question submerged. Now observe what this accumulation does to the relational landscape. When a man's sense of self is organized around provision and obligation, his relationships change at a structural level in ways that neither he nor the people close to him tend to fully articulate. The people he loves are not simply people he loves. They are, in some deep functional sense, the recipients of his ongoing proof of worth. They are the ones for whom he maintains the equipment and pays the bills and arrives on time and handles the things that would otherwise go unhandled. They are, without his choosing it and without their asking for it, the necessary audience for his demonstration that he belongs in the room and deserves to remain there. This creates a particular kind of relational dynamic that does not announce itself. He gives, consistently and without visible complaint, but the giving carries an invisible structural weight that is not manipulation and not transaction, something more unconscious than either, something closer to need disguised as generosity. The giving is how he makes contact with the people he cannot reach through words. The giving is how he says what he cannot otherwise say, what he was not given the architecture to say directly. And when the giving is not received as the communication it is, when the partner or the child or the friend responds to the fixed furnace or the paid bill or the rescheduled meeting, not with recognition of what was being transmitted, but with a different kind of longing, the longing for words, for presence that is not functional, for eye contact that does not have a task attached to it, he registers something he cannot quite name. It arrives as a feeling that resembles failure. It arrives as evidence added to decades of similar evidence that no matter how much he does, it is never precisely the right thing, never the thing that was actually needed, never enough to close the distance. He does not understand and may never understand without a very specific kind of examination that he has been speaking a language the other person does not fully read. He has been transmitting care on a frequency that his own developmental history made uniquely available to him, the frequency of function, of maintained systems, of problems anticipated and solved before they could become crises. The receiver in his life is tuned to a different frequency, or tuned to the same one but waiting for something else alongside it. Neither of them chose this configuration. Both of them feel the gap it produces. He withdraws slightly in response, not completely, never completely, because complete withdrawal would mean abdicating the obligation that now constitutes him, and he cannot do that any more than he can stop being himself. But there is a thinning. A quality of presence begins to narrow. He continues to show up in every functional sense. He stops making attempts to explain why showing up is what he has instead of something else. This is how meaning begins to narrow alongside the withdrawal. Meaning for a man at this stage of his life is not a philosophical concept he has access to through reflection. It is not something he constructs deliberately through examined values or articulated purpose. It is something he experiences obliquely, peripherally, through the felt sense of being needed, of being the person a system cannot currently run without. As long as there is something required of him, as long as someone or something depends on his continued function, he experiences a quality of purpose that approximates, without quite reaching, the feeling of mattering for reasons that have nothing to do with what he produces. When that sense of being functionally necessary begins to diminish, when children become independent adults with their own systems, when careers plateau after decades of ascent, when the infrastructure of daily domestic life no longer requires constant vigilant management, something happens to him that he does not have precise language for, and that the people around him often do not have language for either. It is not depression, though it shares some surface features of depression. It is not grief, though loss is present and real. It is something more structural than either, a quiet confusion that sits in the space where certainty used to be. The system he built and refined and maintained across 40 years is no longer called upon at the same frequency or with the same urgency. He continues to apply it regardless. He looks for things to fix in the absence of things that need fixing. He maintains vigilance over systems that have already stabilized and no longer require vigilance. He is, in some observable sense, performing a function for an audience that has partially moved on, and the performance continues because the performer does not know how to exit without ceasing to be himself. What this reveals at the deepest layer of this investigation is the thing that makes the whole structure most significant and most worth examining with care. Gen X men associate love with obligation. This is not his private psychology. The man who equates love with obligation did not arrive at that equation in isolation through some idiosyncratic personal development. He absorbed it from a cultural moment that was itself producing millions of identical absorptions simultaneously across an entire generation of boys becoming men in the same environment. The post-war economic framework and its idealized breadwinner structure, the masculinity modeled in the films and television programs and advertising of the 1970s and 1980s, the silence of fathers who had their own silence modeled for them by men who survived the Depression and the war and returned without the tools or permission to say what that had cost them.
The institutional reward structures that consistently, reliably, and without ambiguity elevated output over interiority, product over process, provision over presence. None of these were personal to him. None of them selected him individually. All of them acted on him with the impersonal force of environment, the way climate acts, without announcement, without permission, without any acknowledgement that a person is being shaped by forces he did not choose and cannot easily name. He did not become this man through a series of individual choices. He was formed into this man by a convergence of structural pressures that were operating identically on the men around him. And so was the man sitting next to him, and the man across the office, and the man he sees in the mirror and recognizes and has never quite fully understood. What makes this a collective blind spot rather than a collection of private psychologies is exactly the universality of its invisibility. When every man in a generation has organized himself around the same adaptive structure, when the same translation of love into obligation is running in household after household and workplace after workplace and relationship after relationship, no one inside that generation reads the structure as a structure. They read it as reality. They read it as what men are. They read it as the natural order of adult masculine experience, the way water reads the shape of the container it inhabits as simply where water is. The man who feels love primarily as obligation does not look around him and see an anomaly. He looks around and finds confirmation everywhere he looks. The other men in his life operate the same way. They also show up and handle things and do not cry and express care through presence and provision rather than through words. The confirmation is pervasive and consistent and seamless. The structure reproduces itself across the generation precisely because no one inside it can see it clearly enough to name it as a structure. And this is where the investigation reaches its furthest point and stops. Not because it has run out of territory, but because the territory visible from here is sufficient. Here is what is visible. He is standing inside a system he did not choose, did not architect consciously, and cannot easily see from the inside, because he is the inside. The system is not a character flaw. It is not a failure of development. It was a functional adaptation to a real set of environmental pressures, and it produced real outcomes that served real people across real decades. Stability, reliability, provision, consistent presence, problems solved before they became crises. The cost of the system was a particular kind of emotional inaccessibility, a translation problem running in both directions, a narrowing of the frequency on which he could transmit and receive the thing he most needed to communicate, and the thing the people closest to him most needed to receive. That cost was real. It has been paid continuously by him and by them. Neither group fully understood what was being charged. He is not broken. He is the coherent, predictable, structurally inevitable output of a coherent, predictable, structurally inevitable set of forces. You may recognize him now with more precision than you had before. You may find that you are him, or that you have been watching him across a table for 2 decades, without either of you having the exact language for what was happening in the space between the tasks completed and the words that did not come. That recognition is what the investigation was moving toward, not a judgment, not a prescription, not an argument for change, a clear view of a structure that was always present and almost never seen as a structure. The investigation does not ask you to evaluate what you see. It asks only that you see it accurately, possibly for the first time, as a system rather than a personality, as history rather than character, as something that was built slowly and carefully and without conscious intention by real people responding to real conditions across an entire generation, without anyone pausing to notice that a building was going up. The next question this opens belongs to a different investigation entirely. It concerns what a man does when the structure that sustained him begins to be called upon less frequently, when the obligations that organized his sense of self start to thin at the edges, when the things he was built to carry begin, slowly and without drama, to require less carrying. It concerns what he reaches for in the space that opens. It concerns whether he has anything available to reach with. That is a different question for a different time. If something in this investigation named a structure you have been watching or living inside without having language for it, say so in the comments. The comment is not required, but it tells us where the next investigation should go, and that is worth knowing. Subscribe if you want to be here when it continues.